I stood in the living room, holding the bouquet I'd picked out that morning, heart fluttering with excitement. "Here, I thought you might like these," I said softly, expecting even a smile. He glanced up from his phone, barely looking at me, and muttered, "Georgia, that's kind of pathetic. Honestly, why do you even try?" The words sank in, sharper than any cold winter wind. Guests laughed awkwardly, unsure whether to ignore or intervene. I forced a smile, clutching the flowers like a shield, while inside a flicker of something dangerous stirred. How could someone I loved so much dismiss my heart like it was nothing? I realized, in that single, quiet moment, that the humiliation wasn't loud. It was in the indifference, in the way my love could be so casually mocked. I've spent years believing that love meant giving everything, even when no one noticed. Have you ever poured your heart into someone only to be met with indifference? I'm Georgia, and I want to take you through the quiet unraveling of a marriage where my efforts were laughed at, ignored, and called pathetic. This isn't just a story of heartbreak. It's about noticing your worth before someone else forces you to, and learning that the love you deserve starts with yourself. For 6 years, I had built my life around him, his routines, his likes, his moods. Mornings were spent brewing his coffee just the way he liked it. Evenings were devoted to planning little surprises. Dinners were always on time, and birthdays meticulously celebrated. I thought love was measured in these small gestures, in the quiet sacrifices that no one applauded. Friends often commented on how much I gave, and I smiled politely, brushing it off. In my mind, it was normal. Love was labor, patience, and endurance. But slowly, the imbalance became unbearable. While I orchestrated every detail of our life, he offered little in return. Rare thanks, rare acknowledgement, and constant criticism if something wasn't perfect by his standards. I began to notice the emotional ledger of our marriage. Everything flowed from me to him, almost nothing in reverse. My feelings, my excitement, my affection, they were treated like background noise, optional, sometimes even inconvenient. And yet, I persisted, believing that my love, if genuine enough, would eventually awaken gratitude, warmth, maybe even admiration. But even as I planned my evenings, my weekends, my surprises, I felt the quiet erosion of my self-respect. In the very house that should have been my sanctuary, I was the invisible architect of someone else's comfort, and no one, not even him, seemed to care. It started with small things. A dismissive glance when I mentioned my day. A sarcastic chuckle at the effort I put into a dinner he barely noticed. "Georgia, you really overdo it," he'd say, as if my care and attention were laughable. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself I was being sensitive. Maybe he was stressed. Maybe I was imagining things. But the pattern was undeniable. He ignored the little things I did for him, like folding his laundry the way he liked it, or leaving notes in his briefcase. He would complain about trivial mistakes, yet never acknowledge when I went out of my way to make life smoother for him. Even our friends began noticing the subtle mockery in his tone, though most shrugged and said, "That's just him." I noticed. I always noticed. It gnawed at me quietly, this creeping sense that the person I trusted most didn't value me, or worse, took my love for granted. The humiliation wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was woven into our everyday interactions. Every small dig, every overlooked effort, built a pattern that slowly made me question not just him, but myself. By the time I realized what was happening, the damage was already in place. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and yet still holding the fragile thread of hope that things could change. But deep down, I knew I needed to pay attention, not to him, but to myself. The more I withdrew, the more confident he became. At dinner parties, he laughed a little louder at his own jokes, completely unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to how my absence of reaction made me invisible. In meetings with friends or family, he made subtle comments about my pathetic attempts at romance, smiling smugly when I said nothing. His arrogance wasn't explosive. It was quiet, social, and deeply humiliating. At home, the contrast was sharper. Behind closed doors, he expected my full attention and devotion, but any attempt at affection from me was labeled clumsy or embarrassing. I learned quickly that arguing, explaining, or defending myself only fueled his dismissive amusement. The harder I tried, the more he perfected his public mask of control and superiority, all while quietly eroding my confidence. I started to see the pattern clearly. His behavior was not occasional, it was deliberate. He thrived on making me feel small, letting me be present in body while eroding my presence in spirit. And while others saw a composed, loving wife, I was becoming a study in restraint, suppressing frustration, masking hurt, and silently observing every move he made. The escalation was subtle, almost imperceptible to outsiders, yet unbearable from within. I felt my world shrinking, each dismissal a reminder that my efforts were invisible, my love meaningless, and my voice unnecessary. The silence around me was not peace, it was a cage built from indifference, and the key had been in his hands all along. Gradually, I began to doubt myself. Was I really overreacting? Maybe I was too sensitive, too eager to please. He was so convincing, so calm in his dismissal, that even I questioned my own judgment. Friends would ask, "Are you sure you're not taking it too personally?" And I'd nod, forcing a smile, while the knot of confusion in my chest tightened. At home, the gaslighting continued in subtle ways. He'd insist that I had misunderstood his tone, or that my reactions were exaggerated. He reframed situations so smoothly that I began apologizing for things that weren't my fault. My energy drained, my confidence faltered, and I felt trapped in a web of self-doubt that grew denser with every interaction. And yet, I refused to collapse. I maintained my routines, performed my duties, and smiled when necessary. I became a master of quiet endurance, a spectator of my own diminishing world. Inside, I was exhausted, but I clung to a fragile dignity. I still remember the woman I was before the dismissals, the gestures, and the ridicule. The isolation was profound, not because I was physically alone, but because the person closest to me had created a reality where my emotions and efforts no longer mattered. Every smile I offered, every thoughtful gesture I attempted, was met with indifference or subtle derision. And in this silence, this constant questioning of my worth, something inside me started to stir, a recognition that I could not continue like this forever. I had to see clearly, to document quietly and prepare. The first seeds of awareness took root in the loneliness of my endurance, a quiet certainty that one day, the truth would matter more than his arrogance. One evening, after yet another subtle humiliation at a friend's gathering, it felt like the world had closed in completely. He made a show of dismissing my birthday plans in front of everyone, mocking the effort I'd put into a small surprise dinner. Laughter rippled around the room, not cruel but uncomfortable, leaving me exposed and isolated. My cheeks burned, my heart sank, and for the first time, the audience of my own life could almost believe I had nothing left. Even at home, things seemed worse. A mismanaged bill, a forgotten errand he blamed me for, and suddenly, I was the one apologizing, though I had done everything meticulously. It was a social and emotional blow that felt devastating. My confidence wavered, and doubt crept in like fog. Had I been naive to believe that love and effort mattered? Friends offered comfort, but even their words felt inadequate against the relentless pattern of dismissal. He had managed to construct a reality where I appeared powerless, vulnerable, and dependent. To anyone looking in, it seemed as though I was broken, defeated, and helpless, an image far from the truth, but convincing enough to make me hesitate. Yet, beneath the weight of this apparent loss, a quiet part of me remained alert. I didn't collapse entirely. I noted his arrogance, his predictable patterns, the very mistakes he thought would go unnoticed. While the world saw a woman beaten down, I began cataloging every slight, every ridicule, every moment of disregard. And in that hidden space, the first sparks of a plan began to form. For now, he believed victory was his, but the quiet observer within me had not surrendered. In the days that followed, I settled into a strange rhythm. I stopped chasing approval, stopped explaining myself, and stopped reacting to the subtle jabs that once drained me. I continued my life, but now on my own terms, quietly observing every interaction, every word, every expression. He didn't notice the change at first. His confidence, previously unshakable, began to take on a faint rigidity. I no longer sought to please him, yet I maintained the composure of a devoted wife, a careful mask that hid my growing awareness. In public, I smiled, nodded, and performed my role, But inside, I was cataloging, calculating, and taking note. Isolation no longer felt like weakness. It became my tool. Each moment of indifference, each sarcastic remark, was stored in memory, not allowed to pierce my calm. I began to see the patterns clearly, the predictable swings of his moods, the subtle ways he dismissed my efforts, the moments where his arrogance would betray him if anyone looked closely. This quiet endurance was not defeat. It was preparation. I had stopped giving my energy to someone who didn't deserve it, and instead, I directed it inward. I began to reclaim fragments of myself, little by little. The woman he thought he had diminished was still here, watching, learning, and waiting. And somewhere deep inside, I realized that the next move would not be reactive. It would be deliberate, measured, and unstoppable. The quiet gave me clarity. I began to see the patterns in his behavior, how every slight, every dismissive comment, every sarcastic remark was part of a consistent map of control. It wasn't random, and it wasn't about me being too sensitive. It was deliberate, designed to keep me small while he maintained the illusion of superiority. At first, I felt a mix of anger and sorrow, a raw recognition of how much I had given to someone who never intended to reciprocate. But then, something shifted. The shock faded, replaced by a cold, composed awareness. If his actions followed patterns, then patterns could be traced, documented, and anticipated. The same traits that allowed him to dominate me could become evidence of his arrogance and cruelty. I began noting details in subtle ways, dates, conversations, and reactions that no one else would notice. Each time he laughed at me, ignored me, or dismissed my efforts, I stored it in memory and recorded it in quiet, almost invisible ways. These were not acts of revenge yet, they were acts of understanding, building a foundation for control that did not require confrontation, only observation. For the first time in years, I was no longer a participant in his world. I was a careful observer, a strategist. The humiliation no longer had power over me. Its pattern had been uncovered, and with that knowledge came a strange kind of freedom. I realized that the next steps would be deliberate. My energy would no longer be wasted on proving my worth. It would be invested in reclaiming it. And for the first time, I saw the possibility that justice could come quietly, without theatrics, without melodrama, simply by letting truth reveal itself in the right time and place. While he remained oblivious, I quietly began to build my hidden advantage. I documented everything: texts, emails, casual remarks, moments of mockery that he thought would fade into memory. Every sarcastic comment, every dismissive glance, every time he belittled my love was now a piece of evidence, a map of his arrogance that no one else could see. I also reached out to close friends who had witnessed his behavior, carefully verifying details without revealing my plans. Their observations became part of the quiet record I was keeping. I didn't boast, I didn't seek pity, I simply collected the truth, a silent archive of how deeply he underestimated me. Even the small things mattered. The way he complained about my efforts in front of his colleagues, the way he dismissed gestures meant to nurture our home, the subtle gaslighting that made me question my own reality, all of it was carefully noted. In my journal, I chronicled it day by day, phrase by phrase, until the invisible narrative of his arrogance became undeniable. The brilliance of this hidden advantage was that he had no idea. While he assumed I was weak, compliant, and still clinging to his approval, I was becoming untouchable in my awareness. The power was not in confrontation or argument, it was in observation, in documentation, in timing. I began to see that patience, not impulse, was the ultimate weapon. Every act of indifference from me, every withheld smile, every silent refusal to validate his ego was preparing the stage for an inevitable revelation. The audience might not know yet, and he certainly didn't, but I was ready. When the time came, the truth would be undeniable, and I would stand composed while everything he relied on to dominate me collapsed quietly around him. For the first time, I felt a deep satisfaction not in vengeance, but in understanding. I was no longer a victim of his games. I was the quiet architect of my own restoration. And with that realization, my confidence solidified into calm, unshakable certainty. The next steps would be mine to control entirely. As I continued my quiet observation, I noticed something shifting inside me. The constant need for his approval, the exhausting chase to be acknowledged or praised, was slowly dissolving. I realized that I didn't need validation from someone who had never truly valued me. My worth wasn't dependent on his perception. It had always been within me. This transformation didn't happen suddenly. It was gradual, a soft, internal change. I began to prioritize my own needs and emotions, to recognize the joy in small things I had ignored for years, a morning coffee just how I liked it, a book that made me laugh, a walk without explanation or judgment. Each of these moments reinforced the growing certainty that I was enough, independent of him. Emotionally, I became calmer. I stopped reacting to his jabs, stopped apologizing for being myself, stopped performing love for someone who couldn't appreciate it. Instead, I acted with quiet confidence, measured and deliberate. My energy was mine, no longer drained by the constant effort to please or the anxiety of being dismissed. I also began to see him clearly, his arrogance, his patterns, his attempts to control. The man who had once held my self-esteem in his hands now seemed small and predictable. The more I observed, the less power he had over me, because I no longer allowed his actions to dictate my emotions. For the first time, I experienced love not for him, but for myself. And with that love came strength. The humiliation, the dismissal, the exhaustion, all of it became tools, not chains. I understood that patience, self-respect, and calm clarity were far more powerful than any impulsive reaction. This internal shift was more than coping, it was preparation. I wasn't just surviving, I was readying myself to reclaim control. And in that readiness, I felt a quiet thrill, the knowledge that when the time came, I would stand unshaken, composed, and finally free from the weight of his disregard. By now, my approach had become deliberate, almost surgical. I no longer acted on impulse. Every move, every observation, every withheld reaction was part of a careful strategy. I knew that rushing revenge or confrontation would only reveal my intentions and give him an opportunity to adapt. Instead, I focused on control, timing, and patience. I refined my daily routines to emphasize calm composure. Outwardly, I remained the attentive wife, polite and accommodating, yet internally, I catalogued every slight, every dismissive remark, and every moment of arrogance. I observed patterns in his interactions with family, friends, and colleagues, noting the ways he underestimated me. Every predictable misstep became an asset, a piece of leverage I could use later. At the same time, I reclaimed aspects of my life that had been neglected. I reconnected with friends, revisited hobbies, and nurtured parts of myself that had been dormant. Each act of self-care wasn't just healing, it was armor. I knew that the more grounded and confident I became, the more undeniable my eventual rise would be. I also planned quietly for public accountability. Documents, photos, conversations, and witnesses all were part of a meticulous archive that would eventually support my position without requiring confrontation. I didn't need to argue, yell, or fight. The facts themselves would speak. Every step was measured. There was no rush, no drama, only the quiet building of inevitability. He remained unaware, still assuming that I was compliant, still expecting me to react emotionally. And that assumption became my greatest advantage. The stage was set, the pieces were in place, and I was ready to move not with vengeance, but with undeniable clarity, calm authority, and the quiet satisfaction of having regained my power. By the time the world saw the truth, it would be too late for him to deny it. And in that moment, my quiet endurance would become irreversible justice. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A dinner with friends, the same circle where his small humiliations had always taken place. I arrived composed, confident, and entirely unshaken. He greeted me with his usual smirk, expecting compliance, expecting the timid reactions that had once defined me. But this time I offered none. My smile was calm, polite, but carried an unspoken weight he couldn't place. As conversations began, I noticed his subtle attempts to regain control, comments designed to belittle my efforts, small digs meant to elicit embarrassment. I didn't react. I listened, observed, and allowed his arrogance to speak for itself. Every misplaced remark, every overconfident joke, every casual dismissal was now part of a narrative only I and the audience could see clearly. He had returned to the arena expecting a familiar script. The wife who loved too much, who overgave, who sought his approval endlessly. But that script no longer existed. I had rewritten the role entirely. I remained composed, graceful, and measured, all while subtly guiding the environment to highlight his predictable flaws. The power had shifted. Where once I had been vulnerable, now I was untouchable in my awareness. Where once he had dominated, he now revealed himself through arrogance, blind to the fact that each action only strengthened my position. In that space, surrounded by the same people who had witnessed my humiliation before, I finally understood the magnitude of quiet control. I didn't need to raise my voice or create a scene. My restraint, observation, and timing were more powerful than any confrontation could have been. For the first time in years, I felt the thrill of true authority, not loud, not vengeful, but undeniable. The arena was the same, but the game had changed, and I held the winning hand. His confidence began to swell, and with it his arrogance. He assumed that my silence and composure were signs of weakness, of submission. At gatherings, he overcompensated. Louder jokes, sharper sarcasm, more pointed criticisms, all aimed at asserting dominance. He didn't realize that each overreach was a thread I could use to unravel the very image he had built. He mocked my gestures, criticized my choices, and even tried to manipulate friends into questioning my judgment, thinking that I would break or defend myself. But I remained calm, observing every slip, every exaggeration, every lie, as though I were cataloging evidence for a trial that had yet to begin. At home, his overconfidence showed in private as well. He believed I would return to seeking his approval, that I would resume the endless efforts of love he had once dismissed. Instead, I let him speak, let him argue, let him assert control. I didn't interrupt. I didn't explain. I simply recorded his words, memorized the patterns, and watched as he tripped over his own arrogance. The more he tried to dominate, the more apparent it became to anyone watching, or, in my mind, to the future audience of truth, that he was unraveling. His insistence on proving superiority only revealed the very weaknesses he wanted to hide. He was predictable, transparent, and entirely unaware that the power dynamic had shifted completely. By the end of these overreaches, I realized how fragile his control really was. Every boast, every dismissive gesture, every attempt to belittle me was now a tool I could use. The more he revealed himself, the stronger I became, not through confrontation, but through quiet observation and strategic patience. He believed he was winning, but in truth, he was building the evidence for his own downfall, and I was ready to let it unfold at the perfect moment. The moment came quietly, without fanfare. At a small gathering of friends and family, the same circle where years of dismissals and subtle humiliations had occurred, I let the facts speak for themselves. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply presented the reality of his actions, the consistent pattern of arrogance, belittlement, and disregard, piece by piece, in calm, measured words. I shared instances he had thought invisible, the mocking remarks at my birthday, the sarcastic jabs in front of friends, the countless moments when my love and effort were ignored or ridiculed. I recounted conversations, noted patterns, and referenced the documentation I had quietly collected over months. Every detail was precise, undeniable, and supported by witnesses who had observed his behavior over the years. As I spoke, I noticed a shift. His confidence smirk faltered. He attempted to interrupt, to justify, to twist the narrative, but the foundation I had built was unshakable. Each fact, each carefully preserved piece of evidence, countered his arguments effortlessly. There was no shouting, no melodrama, only a composed, unwavering truth that highlighted the disparity between his perception and reality. People began to see him differently. Their expressions changed from uncertainty to recognition. The casual dismissals, the subtle cruelty, the arrogance that had gone unnoticed or excused for years, all became visible in the light of facts and clarity. And through it all, I remained quiet, composed, my power amplified by the simple act of letting reality speak louder than any confrontation could. In that space, the humiliation he had inflicted over the years began to reverse. My calm authority, my clear recounting of events, and my refusal to be reactive exposed his behavior in a way that no one could ignore. The truth was no longer mine alone. It was shared, witnessed, undeniable. And in that quiet release, I felt it. The culmination of years of endurance, observation, and patience. The moment when quiet power triumphs over arrogance and dignity reclaims its place, all without a raised voice or a scene. The story had shifted, and the balance of control had finally returned to me. He tried to salvage the moment, to argue, to redirect attention, but it was too late. The carefully constructed image of superiority he had spent years cultivating crumbled quietly in front of friends, family, and colleagues. His smirks faltered, his laughter became forced, and the subtle air of dominance that had defined him for so long evaporated. People began to recognize the truth in ways they hadn't before. The casual dismissals, the sarcastic remarks, the invisible undermining, all became visible in the calm, factual recounting I had presented. Those who had once assumed I was overreacting now saw the consistent pattern of his behavior clearly. He attempted to regain control, but every move only revealed his arrogance further. Each interruption, each defensive comment, each attempt to justify his actions backfired. The very confidence he had relied on for years became evidence of his own misjudgment. And through it all, I remained composed, silent where necessary, letting the facts and observations speak for themselves. It wasn't cruelty that toppled him, it was clarity. The quiet, deliberate patience, the documentation, the unwavering composure had achieved what anger or confrontation never could. His reputation, once seemingly untouchable, had fractured in subtle but irreversible ways. And as the room absorbed the reality of his behavior, I realized that the balance of power had shifted entirely. No theatrics were needed, no melodrama. The collapse was public, undeniable, and complete, all because truth and quiet endurance had been my allies. For the first time, the humiliation he had imposed over years was fully reflected back, and I stood unshaken, empowered, and finally free. The aftermath was surprisingly calm. He retreated into private reflection, forced to confront the gap between the image he had projected and the reality everyone now recognized. Socially, his credibility had diminished. Colleagues and friends approached him differently, no longer assuming his superiority. Legally and financially, I ensured that all steps were taken carefully, but even there, my measured patience had given me the upper hand. Meanwhile, I rebuilt my life quietly but intentionally. My home became a sanctuary, filled with things that brought me joy and comfort. Each small choice was a reminder that my happiness was mine to define, not dependent on someone else's approval. I invested time in myself, in friendships, in passions I had neglected, and in the process rediscovered the strength I had always carried inside. The most profound change was internal. I no longer measured my worth through the lens of his perception. The patience, observation, and quiet endurance had brought me not just justice, but clarity and freedom. I had proven to myself that dignity and calm, paired with strategic awareness, could overcome years of disrespect. And through it all, the world moved on. People noticed the shift, but there was no spectacle, no dramatic vindication, just quiet consequences and the natural unfolding of truth. The balance had been restored, and I finally understood that the most important love, the one that matters most, is the love you give yourself. Looking back, I realized the journey wasn't just about exposing his arrogance or reclaiming my dignity, it was about discovering myself. For years, I had measured my worth through the lens of someone who could never see it. The quiet endurance, the careful observation, and the patient documentation weren't just tools for justice, they were acts of self-preservation and self-respect. I learned that love, when unreciprocated, can become a form of self-erasure. But when redirected inward, it becomes empowerment. The woman who once sought validation in another's approval now walks confidently in her own light. I cherish my time, my choices, my joys, and the people who truly see me. There is no need for spectacle, no need for revenge framed as drama. The dignity of quiet strength, the calm of patience, and the inevitability of truth are enough to restore balance. I am no longer defined by humiliation, by his dismissals, or by the past. I am defined by the deliberate love I give myself every day, the resilience I cultivated in silence, and the awareness that my worth is inherent, not negotiated. And in that understanding, I am finally free.